There's a generation that never asked for your attention. They grew up in the space between supervision and neglect, learning to solve their own problems before the internet could do it for them. They watched their parents work themselves to exhaustion for companies that didn't care, then quietly built lives where loyalty meant something different. You probably know someone like this. They're funny but guarded, competent but skeptical, present but emotionally somewhere else. They don't post their feelings online. They don't explain themselves. And if you've ever wondered why they seem so comfortable with chaos while simultaneously expecting disappointment, you're noticing something that was carved into them decades ago. This is the psychology of Generation X. Generation X refers to people born roughly between 1965 and 1980, though the psychology we're discussing here transcends exact birth years. It's more about a particular emotional architecture, a way of moving through the world that was shaped by very specific circumstances. These are people who learned self-reliance before it was a choice. As children, many came home to empty houses, made their own meals, and entertained themselves for hours without adult intervention. This wasn't neglect in the clinical sense for most. It was just how life worked when both parents had to work, and supervision wasn't considered a constant necessity. Emotionally, Gen X tends to operate with a kind of practiced detachment, not coldness exactly, but a protective distance. They're often deeply feeling people who've learned to keep their emotional machinery running quietly in the background. In conversation, they use humor as both connection and deflection. They're more likely to make a self-deprecating joke than to directly express vulnerability. Socially, they tend towards small, trusted circles rather than broad networks. And they value competence and follow through over enthusiasm and promises. They're the colleagues who get things done without fanfare, the friends who show up in a crisis without being asked, the parents who teach their children independence because that's the gift they know how to give. There's often a quality of watchfulness to them. They notice things. They read rooms. They assess situations quickly because they had to learn that skill early. And beneath their ironic exterior, many carry a quiet exhaustion, not from working hard, but from having been on their own internal alert system for most of their lives. To understand Gen X psychology, you have to understand the world that shaped them. They grew up during a unique moment in Western history when childhood was being redefined in real time. Many Gen X children experience what we now call latchkey childhood. Both parents working, divorce rates climbing, economic uncertainty forcing longer work hours. These weren't just statistics, they were the backdrop of daily life. A Gen X child might come home at 3 o'clock to an empty house, let themselves in with a key worn on a string around their neck, and manage their afternoon alone until a parent returned at 6 or 7. They made snacks, did homework, watched TV, resolved their own boredom. This happened not once in a while, but as a daily pattern for years. What this creates psychologically is a kind of premature self-sufficiency. These children learned that their needs wouldn't always be immediately met by an adult, so they developed the capacity to meet those needs themselves. The psychological term for this is functional independence, but it comes with a cost. When you learn too early that you're on your own, you internalize the belief that asking for help is somehow a failure. You become competent, yes, but also emotionally self-contained in ways that can feel isolating later in life. From what I've observed, many Gen X adults carry an interesting contradiction. They're incredibly capable of handling crises, but they struggle with the quieter emotional labor of letting people in. They learned to be strong when strength was required, but they never really learned that it's okay to not be strong sometimes. The cultural environment reinforced this. Gen X came of age during the 1980s and 90s, an era that glorified individualism, economic competition, and the certain cynicism about institutions. They watched their parents get laid off after decades of company loyalty. They saw political scandals that eroded trust and authority. They inherited a world that seemed to promise less than what their parents had. The social contract was fraying and they could feel it. In psychological terms, this created what's called a low-trust baseline. Paranoia exactly, but a general assumption that systems will fail you, people will disappoint you, and the only truly reliable resource is yourself. This isn't pessimism, it's pattern recognition from lived experience. The media they consumed reflected this back to them. Gen X culture was saturated with anti-heroes, ironic detachment, and a certain resistance to earnestness. Sincerity felt dangerous. Caring too much meant setting yourself up for disappointment, so humor became armor and irony became a language. But beneath that armor, there's often a deep capacity for care that was never quite allowed full expression. In my opinion, this is where much of the Gen X emotional complexity lives, in the gap between what they feel and what they've learned is safe to show. Psychologically, what we're describing aligns with attachment theory, particularly a pattern sometimes called dismissive attachment. This isn't a disorder, it's an adaptation. When children experience inconsistent emotional availability from caregivers, they learn to minimize their own attachment needs. They develop independence as a survival strategy. They become the kind of adults who say, "I'm fine," and genuinely mean it, not because they don't have feelings, but because they've trained themselves to manage those feelings internally. Research on resilience also helps explain the Gen X profile. Studies have shown that children who experience moderate levels of stress without being overwhelmed can develop what's called stress inoculation. They become better at handling adversity later in life. Gen X experienced this at scale. They dealt with adult-sized problems with child-sized resources, and many came out the other side genuinely more capable. But that capability often coexists with what researchers call vigilant coping, a constant low-level readiness for things to go wrong. There's also evidence that people who experience early autonomy develop stronger executive function and problem-solving skills. In X-adults tend to be resourceful, pragmatic, and good in emergencies. But those same strengths can make it difficult to be vulnerable, to ask for help, or to believe that someone else might handle things as well as they would. What's particularly interesting is the way Gen X processes emotion. There's research suggesting that people who learn emotional self-regulation early, essentially who don't have caregivers consistently helping them name and process feelings, develop a more internal emotional life. They feel deeply, but they've learned to keep that feeling contained. To outsiders, this can look like stoicism or even coldness. From the inside, it often feels like carrying a weight that no one else can see. I believe this is why Gen X is often described as the forgotten generation. They don't demand attention. They don't broadcast their struggles. They were taught that the world doesn't stop for your feelings, so they learned to keep moving regardless of how they felt. And in a culture that increasingly values emotional expression and visibility, their quiet competence can make them nearly invisible. The central contradiction of Gen X psychology is this: they're deeply independent but often profoundly lonely. They learn to be self-sufficient because they had to, but self-sufficiency is exhausting when it becomes your only mode. They're skeptical of authority but crave stability. They watched institutions fail people they loved, so they don't trust systems, but they also grew up in a world where stability was still somewhat accessible if you worked hard enough. Now, as adults, they're often caught between the cynicism they learned early and the yearning for something reliable. They value authenticity but communicate through layers of irony. Earnestness feels vulnerable, so they wrap genuine feelings in humor and sarcasm. This can make them difficult to read. A Gen X person might say something cutting and funny when what they really mean is, "I care about this and I'm scared to show it." They're excellent in a crisis, but struggle with everyday emotional intimacy. When something breaks, they know exactly what to do, but sitting with someone in quiet vulnerability, allowing themselves to be seen in their uncertainty, that's often harder. The competence that saved them as children can become a barrier to connection as adults. From what I've observed, many Gen X individuals carry a quiet grief for the childhood they didn't quite get to have. They're proud of their resilience, and they should be, but sometimes resilience is just another word for, "I had no choice." There's a mourning beneath the irony, a sadness they've never quite known how to name. You see Gen X psychology in small, everyday moments. It's the parent who never complains but always gets things done, the friend who makes a dark joke when they're actually hurting, the colleague who solves everyone else's problems but never mentions their own. It's the person who's incredibly generous with their time and skills but deeply uncomfortable when someone tries to do something for them. Who will help you move, fix your computer, give you career advice, but who deflects when you ask how they're doing? It's the way they prepare for disaster without drama, extra supplies in the car, and backup plans for the backup plans. A low-grade expectation that something will probably go wrong, and when it does, they're the first to respond with calm competence. It's also in their relationship with technology. Dada! Many Gen X people use social media, but maintain a certain distance from it. They're present, but not performative. They share, but selectively. They remember a world before constant connectivity, and part of them still lives there, still values privacy, still finds something hollow about curated online personas. And it's in their parenting, if they're parents. Many Gen X adults are trying to give their children the emotional presence they didn't always receive, but sometimes they struggle with how to do it. They know how to teach independence, but tenderness without purpose feels foreign. They're learning, often alongside their kids, what it means to be emotionally available. Gen X was shaped by a particular kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of being competent in a world that didn't see how much that competence cost them. They learned to be strong before they learned they were allowed to be soft. They became self-reliant before they understood that connection was a need, not a weakness. In my opinion, we owe this generation more recognition than we give them, not applause. They'd find that uncomfortable, but simple acknowledgement. They kept things running when no one was watching. They raised themselves and then raised others. They survived the space between the old world and the new one, and they did it with humor and grit and very little complaint. If you recognize yourself in this, know that your strength is real, but so is your right to rest. You don't always have to be the capable one. You don't always have to handle it alone. And if you love someone with this psychology, understand that their distance isn't rejection. Their humor isn't dismissal. Their competence isn't a wall. It's just the language they learned when no one was there to teach them a softer one. They're still here, still watching, still carrying more than they'll ever say. And maybe that's the most Gen X thing of all, to be essential and invisible at the same time, to matter deeply while expecting to be forgotten. They won't ask you to remember them, but perhaps that's exactly why we should.